The cafe was unusually quiet for a Friday afternoon, except for the heated exchange near the counter. The cafe owner, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a crisp apron, pointed an accusing finger at a man in a neatly pressed military uniform. "I don't care who you are," the owner barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the patrons. "I don't serve your kind here. Out." The man in uniform, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably proud of his service, stood frozen. His dark skin, marked with faint scars that hinted at battles fought far from this place, only seemed to fuel the owner's fury. "You heard me," the owner snarled. "Get out of my cafe." A hush fell over the room, the air so thick with tension that even the sound of a fork clinking against a plate was deafening. And then, from the corner of the cafe, someone rose from their seat. "You might want to rethink that," a deep, commanding voice said. The entire cafe turned to see who had spoken, and the owner's face turned pale as he recognized the figure standing by the window. Earlier that day, the cafe had been bustling with its usual crowd. Locals from the small town stopped in for their usual orders: coffee, bagels, and a bit of gossip. The owner, Samuel, ran the place with a firm hand and an unspoken rule: stick to what he considered the right crowd. When a stranger walked in wearing a military uniform, heads turned. It wasn't every day that someone like him, black, proud, and exuding confidence, stepped into this cafe. His name was Jackson Reed, a retired veteran who had recently moved to town. He had heard about the cafe and decided to check it out, unaware of Samuel's prejudices. Jackson approached the counter with a polite smile. "Good afternoon. I'll have a black coffee, please." Samuel didn't even look up at first, scribbling in his notebook. "We're closed." Jackson glanced around at the patrons enjoying their meals. "Doesn't look closed to me." Now Samuel looked up, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Jackson. "We don't serve people like you here." Jackson's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" Samuel leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You heard me. You're not welcome here." Jackson stood his ground. "I fought for this country. I think I've earned the right to a cup of coffee." Samuel's lip curled. "Not in my cafe, you haven't." The room fell silent as the tension grew. Some patrons looked uncomfortable, while others avoided meeting Jackson's gaze. One older man shifted uneasily in his seat, muttering something under his breath, but no one spoke up. Jackson sighed, stepping back from the counter. "You know, I've faced worse than this, but I didn't expect it from someone I'd call a fellow American." Samuel crossed his arms. "Like I said, out." Jackson turned to leave, his face calm but his eyes blazing with controlled anger. He hadn't noticed the figure sitting by the window, an older man in a weathered leather jacket, sipping coffee and watching everything unfold. As Jackson reached the door, the man by the window stood. He was tall, with a quiet but undeniable presence that silenced the room without a word. "Samuel," the man said, his voice steady. "I'd like a word." Samuel froze. He recognized the man instantly. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. The man was someone he couldn't afford to ignore, and the weight of his gaze felt heavier than any reprimand Samuel had faced before. The cafe seemed to hold its breath as the man approached the counter, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Every patron in the room leaned forward, waiting to see what would happen next. Jackson, meanwhile, had stopped in his tracks, sensing that something was happening behind him. He turned just in time to see the man at the counter lock eyes with Samuel. "Is this how you treat people who've served this country?" the man asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. Samuel stammered, the bravado from moments ago draining from his face. "I didn't mean any harm." The man raised an eyebrow. "You didn't mean any harm? I think you've done plenty." Jackson's heart pounded as he watched the exchange. He didn't know who this man was, but he could tell he was someone important. The tension in the room shifted, and for the first time since walking into the cafe, Jackson felt a flicker of hope. The older man turned to Jackson, giving him a small nod. "You're not alone in this, son. Not by a long shot." Samuel's face turned red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But before he could say anything, the man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried an unmistakable threat. "You'll regret this," he said. The words hung in the air, leaving the entire room on edge. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone could feel that something big was about to unfold. And then the man turned back to Jackson. "Let's get you that coffee." The cafe was silent as the man at the counter motioned for Jackson to sit down. Samuel stood frozen, his face a mix of anger and fear. The patrons exchanged glances, wondering who the mysterious man was and why his presence carried so much weight. Jackson hesitated for a moment before walking back to the counter, his steps steady but cautious. The man behind the counter, the one who had stood up for him, was older, with a sharp, commanding gaze that seemed to pierce through Samuel's defiance. "What's your name, son?" the man asked Jackson, his tone warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the icy silence in the room. "Jackson Reed, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension. The man nodded. "Nice to meet you, Jackson. I'm William. William Harrington." Samuel's jaw tightened. The name carried weight in this town. William Harrington was a retired judge, a man whose word had shaped more than a few lives in the community. His reputation was one of fairness and integrity, but also of someone who didn't tolerate injustice in any form. "Samuel," William said, turning back to the cafe owner, "I'd like to know why you think it's acceptable to treat a veteran, or anyone for that matter, with such blatant disrespect." Samuel stammered, his bravado from earlier completely gone. "I didn't mean it like that, Judge Harrington. I have my rules." "Rules?" William raised an eyebrow. "What rules justify turning away someone who served this country?" Samuel's face turned red. "It's not personal. I just think certain people bring trouble." William's voice dropped, low and firm. "Trouble? The only trouble I see is coming from behind this counter." Earlier that morning, Samuel had woken up in his modest home above the cafe, irritated by a restless night. The cafe had been struggling financially, and he was feeling the pressure. Though he wouldn't admit it to anyone, he knew his prejudices often drove away potential customers. But in his mind, sticking to what he believed was the right crowd was more important than profits. He had started his day the same way he always did, brewing coffee, organizing pastries, and scowling at the news playing on the small television in the corner. The headlines were filled with stories of protests and debates about equality, topics Samuel preferred to ignore. By the time Jackson walked in, Samuel's patience was already thin. Seeing the uniform hadn't softened his stance. If anything, it made him dig in his heels further, a stubbornness born out of years of unchecked biases. Now, standing face to face with William Harrington, Samuel was beginning to regret his choices. The judge's eyes bore into him, unflinching and stern. "Do you have something to say, Samuel?" William pressed. Samuel opened his mouth to respond, but a voice from the back of the room interrupted him. "This isn't the first time he's done this," a young woman said. She stood up, her arms crossed and her face full of determination. "Last month, he refused to serve my friend because she's Hispanic. He told her to find somewhere more fitting for her kind." Murmurs spread through the room. Others began to share similar stories. Samuel refusing service, making snide comments, or finding excuses to drive people out who didn't meet his narrow idea of acceptable. Jackson listened in silence, his hands clenched into fists under the table. He had encountered racism before, but seeing a community quietly tolerate it stirred a deep anger in him. He wasn't just angry at Samuel. He was angry at everyone who had let it slide. William raised a hand, and the murmurs quieted. "It seems you have a pattern, Samuel. Would you care to explain?" Samuel's face was now pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. No excuses," William interrupted. His voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable authority. "You owe Mr. Reed an apology, and I expect you to give it." The room went silent, every eye on Samuel. For a moment, it seemed like he might comply. But then his face hardened, and he shook his head. "I don't owe him anything," Samuel said, his voice shaking but defiant. "This is my cafe, and I'll run it how I see fit." Jackson stood up, his towering frame casting a shadow over Samuel. You think you can treat people like this without consequences? You think this is how a business thrives? Before Samuel could respond, the door to the cafe swung open with a loud bang. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. One of them, a tall woman with a stern expression, walked straight to William. "Judge Harrington," she said, nodding in acknowledgement. "We got your call." William nodded. "Thank you for coming, Officer Banks. I believe this establishment is in violation of several anti-discrimination laws." The cafe erupted in whispers as the realization of what was happening sank in. Samuel's face turned a ghostly shade of white. "You can't do this," Samuel protested, his voice cracking. "This is my business." Officer Banks looked at him coldly. "Your business is subject to the law, Mr. Samuel. And right now, it seems like you've broken it." The tension in the cafe reached its peak as the officers began taking statements from the patrons. Jackson watched in silence, his anger tempered by a sense of vindication. He hadn't come here looking for trouble, but trouble had found him, and he was determined not to let it slide. William placed a reassuring hand on Jackson's shoulder. "You don't have to fight this alone. There are good people who will stand with you." Jackson nodded, his jaw tight. "I appreciate that, sir. But this fight is far from over." As the officers led Samuel to the back to discuss the allegations, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. The sound startled everyone, and for a moment, the room fell silent again. "What was that?" someone whispered. The door to the kitchen swung open, and a figure emerged, someone no one expected to see. The cafe froze as the figure stepped into the room. A tall man in his late 50s, dressed in an immaculate gray suit, adjusted his cufflinks with a calm precision. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room with the cold detachment of someone used to commanding authority. "Well, this is an interesting development," he said, his voice smooth but laced with a quiet menace. Samuel's face turned a shade paler. "Mr. Carter," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. William Harrington turned, his expression unreadable. "And who might you be?" "Charles Carter," the man said, offering a thin smile. "Owner of this building and, as of this moment, former landlord to Mr. Samuel here." The room buzzed with murmurs. Jackson leaned toward William, his voice low. "You know him?" William nodded slightly. "Unfortunately, yes. Charles Carter is a prominent real estate magnate around here. He owns half the businesses on this block." Carter walked further into the cafe, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "It's not every day that I'm dragged into such colorful drama," he said, his gaze flicking to Jackson for a moment before settling on Samuel. "I'm here because I received a call about some rather unsavory behavior happening under my roof." Samuel's hands shook as he tried to respond. I can explain." Carter raised a hand to silence him. "Oh, I'm sure you can. But let me make one thing clear. You're done here, Samuel. Effective immediately." Earlier that morning, Charles Carter had been sitting in his sprawling office, reviewing contracts, when his assistant burst in, clearly flustered. She informed him about the growing buzz surrounding Samuel's cafe. Several local community leaders were already expressing outrage on social media, and the story was spreading fast. Carter wasn't the kind of man to let bad press affect his business empire. Without hesitation, he made a few phone calls, deciding to handle the matter personally. He had no patience for people who caused problems, especially if they threatened his reputation. Now, standing in the cafe, Carter's demeanor was icy. "I run a tight ship, Samuel," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "I expect professionalism and respect from my tenants. You've not only embarrassed yourself, but also brought unnecessary attention to this building." Samuel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Please, Mr. Carter, I can fix this. I'll apologize." Carter shook his head. Too late for that. The patrons, sensing a spectacle, leaned in closer. Some whispered among themselves, others recorded the scene on their phones. Jackson watched quietly, unsure whether to feel satisfaction or discomfort. The fight for justice wasn't over, but seeing Samuel brought low, stirred mixed emotions in him. William stepped forward. Mr. Carter, while I appreciate your intervention, I hope you're not just here to save face. This isn't just about appearances. It's about doing what's right. Carter's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Of course, Judge Harrington, I have every intention of addressing this properly. He turned to Officer Banks. Officers, I assume you'll be handling this matter according to the law? Banks nodded. We're gathering statements and reviewing the complaints. If necessary, charges will be filed. Good, Carter said, his tone clipped. Samuel, you have until the end of the day to vacate the premises. Consider your lease terminated. Samuel's knees seemed to buckle as he stumbled back against the counter. But this is my livelihood. Carter shrugged. Perhaps you should have considered that before alienating half the town. The tension in the cafe began to shift. While many were glad to see Samuel held accountable, others felt uneasy about the sudden arrival of Charles Carter. His polished demeanor and swift actions felt less like justice and more like damage control. Jackson finally broke his silence. What happens next? He asked, his voice directed at William and Officer Banks. William glanced at Carter before answering. We follow through, Jackson. This isn't just about Samuel. It's about setting a precedent. If we let this go unchallenged, it'll happen again. Jackson nodded, his expression resolute. I've dealt with people like him my whole life. I'm not backing down. The cafe door swung open again, and a woman stepped inside. She was dressed in a plain brown coat, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her face was lined with worry, and she clutched a manila envelope tightly in her hands. I'm looking for Jackson Reed, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jackson turned toward her, surprised. That's me. Can I help you? The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around the room before settling on Jackson. You don't know me, but I know about you. I have something you need to see. She extended the envelope toward him. Jackson took it, frowning as he opened it. Inside were several photographs and documents, each one more shocking than the last. His hands shook as he flipped through the contents. What is this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes filled with tears. It's proof, she said. Proof of what's really been happening in this town, and why you're in more danger than you realize. The room seemed to close in around Jackson as the weight of her words sank in. He glanced at William, who was watching him closely, and then back at the woman. Start talking, he said. The cafe fell silent again as all eyes turned to the mysterious woman. Jackson tightened his grip on the envelope, his mind racing. The contents had shaken him, but he needed answers before jumping to conclusions. William Harrington stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. Ma'am, perhaps you should explain exactly what you've brought and why it concerns Mr. Reed. The woman glanced nervously at the patrons before speaking. My name is Clara Stevens. I used to work at the county records office, she began, her voice trembling. Until I found something I wasn't supposed to. Jackson frowned. Something you weren't supposed to? Clara nodded. Documents, files, evidence of systemic discrimination, property sales, zoning laws, and lease agreements, all designed to push minorities out of this town. The room buzzed with murmurs again, and Jackson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What does that have to do with me? Clara pointed at the envelope. Because your name is in those files, Mr. Reed. You were targeted the moment you arrived. Earlier that day, Clara had sat in her small apartment, staring at the envelope she had meticulously gathered over the past few months. She had discovered the documents accidentally while archiving old records. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a coincidence. But the deeper she dug, the more connections she found. Clara had uncovered a network of discriminatory practices orchestrated by powerful figures in the town, including Charles Carter. From manipulating lease terms to denying loans and licenses, they had created a system that ensured people like Jackson were excluded or driven out. Her hands trembled as she placed the last document in the envelope. She knew the risks of coming forward, but her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. When she heard about the incident at the cafe, she saw an opportunity to act. Back in the cafe, Jackson stared at Clara, his mind reeling. You're saying this wasn't just some random act of bigotry? Clara shook her head. No, Samuel's behavior is part of a larger plan. They make life unbearable for people of color, veterans, or anyone who doesn't fit their mold. And Mr. Carter is at the center of it. Charles Carter's face darkened. That's a serious accusation, he said, his voice low but menacing. I'd be careful about spreading baseless claims. Clara met his gaze, her voice steady now. They're not baseless. I have the proof. William stepped closer to Clara and Jackson, his presence a calming force. Let me see that, he said, gesturing toward the envelope. Jackson handed it over, and William began flipping through the documents. His expression grew grimmer with each page. When he finally looked up, his jaw was set, and his eyes were blazing with anger. This, he said, holding up one of the papers, is a signed contract denying Jackson's application for housing in town, citing insufficient qualifications, but everything on this form shows he met the requirements. Jackson's chest tightened. That's why my first lease fell through, he muttered, his voice tinged with realization. William continued. And this, zoning restrictions placed on properties owned by minorities, making it impossible to run businesses legally. These restrictions weren't even publicly disclosed. Carter's face remained calm, but a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. I don't know what you think you've found, Judge Harrington, but I can assure you my dealings are above board. William turned to the officers. I believe these documents warrant further investigation. Wouldn't you agree, Officer Banks? Banks nodded, her expression unreadable. We'll take these into evidence and review them thoroughly. Samuel, who had been silently stewing behind the counter, suddenly erupted. This is ridiculous, he shouted, slamming his fist on the counter. You're all just trying to ruin me and this cafe. Carter shot him a sharp look, but Samuel was beyond reason. I've worked hard to keep this place running, and I don't need some outsider ruining it. Jackson turned to Samuel, his voice calm but filled with conviction. This isn't about ruining you. This is about justice. Samuel sneered. Justice? You don't belong here. None of you do. Before anyone could respond, Samuel lunged toward Clara, his face twisted with rage. You think you can destroy me with your lies? Jackson reacted instinctively, stepping between them and grabbing Samuel's arm. Back off, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The cafe erupted into chaos as patrons jumped to their feet. Officers rushed forward, pulling Samuel away and restraining him. He struggled against their grip, his voice rising to a fevered pitch. You're all fools, he screamed. You don't know what you're dealing with. As the officers dragged him toward the door, Samuel twisted his head to look at Carter. You think you're safe? They'll find out about you too. Carter's expression didn't waver, but his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. The room seemed to hold its breath as Samuel was escorted out, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Jackson turned back to Clara. If what you're saying is true, this goes deeper than just a cafe owner with a chip on his shoulder. Clara nodded. It does. And if we don't act now, it'll only get worse. William placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder. We'll act, Jackson. But this isn't going to be easy. People like Carter don't give up their power without a fight. Carter, who had remained silent during Samuel's outburst, finally spoke. I don't know what kind of conspiracy theories you're entertaining, but I suggest you tread carefully. Accusations like this can ruin lives. William's gaze didn't waver. The truth has a way of coming out, Mr. Carter, and I intend to make sure it does. Carter smiled thinly. We'll see about that. As he turned to leave, Carter paused by the door, glancing over his shoulder. Oh, and Jackson? Welcome to town. The words carried an edge that sent a chill down Jackson's spine. He watched as Carter walked out, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the cafe. As the tension settled, William turned to Jackson and Clara. We need to move fast. If Carter's as powerful as I think he is, he won't sit idly by while we dig into his affairs. Jackson nodded. I'm ready. Clara hesitated before speaking. There's more. The documents I gave you are just the beginning. I have copies of others, hidden in case something happens to me. What do you mean, happens to you? Jackson asked, his voice sharp. Clara's eyes darted to the window, as if expecting someone to burst in. "I've been followed ever since I started looking into this. I'm not safe." William exchanged a look with Jackson. "Then we'll make sure you're protected," he said firmly. "But we need to see everything you have." Clara nodded. "I'll take you to it." As the three prepared to leave, a loud crash came from the alley behind the cafe. The sound of shattered glass echoed through the room, followed by the roar of an engine. William rushed to the window, his face darkening as he looked outside. "Someone's sending a message," he said grimly. Jackson joined him and froze. A brick had been thrown through the cafe's back window, and scrawled across the shattered glass in red paint was a single word: "Leave." The word "leave" dripped down the shattered glass, the red paint pooling on the floor. The cafe was silent, the gravity of the message weighing heavily on everyone inside. Jackson clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he stared at the threat. William turned to Officer Banks. "Get someone to secure the scene and check the alley. Whoever did this can't have gone far." Banks nodded, motioning for her partner to follow her outside. The remaining patrons, now visibly uneasy, began whispering among themselves. Some glanced at the door, as if contemplating leaving before things escalated further. Clara grabbed Jackson's arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what I was afraid of. They're trying to scare us." Jackson looked at her, his expression hard but steady. "They can try, but I'm not going anywhere." William nodded in agreement. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. But it also means we're rattling the right people." Outside, Banks scanned the alley, her flashlight cutting through the fading daylight. The shattered remains of a car window glinted on the pavement, and tire marks led away from the scene. She crouched down, running her fingers over the still wet paint on the brick. "Fresh," she muttered. "They couldn't have gone far." Her partner, a younger officer with nervous energy, looked around. "Do you think it's connected to the documents?" Banks straightened, her gaze sharp. "Absolutely. And if we don't act fast, it's going to get worse." Back inside, William addressed the cafe patrons. "I understand if some of you want to leave, but I urge you to stay calm. This isn't just about one cafe or one person. It's about a system that's been in place for far too long." A few nodded, but others quietly gathered their things and slipped out. Jackson couldn't blame them. Not everyone was built for a fight like this. "Clara," William said, turning to her. "We need to see those other documents now." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the door. "They're in my apartment. But if they know what I've already shared, they might go after me." "They might," William admitted. "But we can't let fear stop us." "I'll go with her," Jackson said firmly. "No one's touching those files, not while I'm around." William looked at him, his face a mixture of admiration and concern. "All right, but we move carefully. Clara, do you have a safe way to get there?" She nodded. "There's a side exit. It's not far." William turned to Banks as she re-entered the cafe. "We're heading to Clara's apartment. Can you spare an officer to accompany us?" Banks hesitated. "We're stretched thin right now, but I'll call in someone to meet you there." "That'll have to do," William said. "Let's move." The walk to Clara's apartment was tense. Jackson stayed close to her, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. William walked slightly ahead, his steps steady and deliberate. The streets felt quieter than usual, as if the town itself was holding its breath. When they reached Clara's building, she paused at the door, fumbling with her keys. "It's on the second floor," she said. "I hid the documents in a safe place." As they climbed the narrow staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoed eerily. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Inside the apartment, Clara hurried to a closet and pulled out a small lockbox. "Everything's in here," she said, placing it on the table. William opened it and began sifting through the papers. Jackson leaned over, his eyes scanning the pages. The files painted a damning picture: falsified reports, altered contracts, and emails detailing coordinated efforts to target minorities. "This is enough to bring down everyone involved," William said, his voice low. "But it's also enough to make them desperate." Before anyone could respond, a loud bang echoed through the apartment. The sound of splintering wood came from the front door, followed by heavy footsteps. "Get down," Jackson shouted, pulling Clara behind the table as the door burst open. Two masked men stormed in, their movements quick and aggressive. One carried a bat, the other a crowbar. "Give us the files, and no one gets hurt," the man with the bat growled. William stepped forward, his hands raised. "Let's not do anything rash. We can." The man swung the bat, narrowly missing William's head. "I said, give us the files." Jackson moved swiftly, grabbing a chair and throwing it at the man with the crowbar. The impact knocked him off balance, giving Jackson enough time to tackle him to the ground. The two wrestled as Clara screamed, clutching the lockbox to her chest. William grabbed a lamp and swung it at the man with the bat, landing a solid hit on his arm. The man yelled in pain, dropping the weapon. Jackson managed to pin the other man, but the struggle was fierce. "Clara, run!" Jackson shouted, his voice strained. Clara hesitated, clutching the lockbox tightly, before bolting toward the back door. The man with the bat tried to chase her, but William blocked his path, standing firm despite his age. "Over my dead body," William said, his voice like steel. The man smirked, raising his fist, but the sound of sirens in the distance made him pause. "We're out of time," he snarled to his accomplice. The men broke free, shoving past William and Jackson as they fled through the broken door. Jackson started to give chase, but William stopped him. "Let them go," he said. "The police will handle it." When the officers arrived, Clara returned with the lockbox, her hands shaking but her resolve unbroken. Jackson gave his statement, recounting every detail of the attack. William placed a reassuring hand on Jackson's shoulder. "You did well, son. But this is just the beginning." Jackson nodded, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the shattered door. "They're trying to scare us into silence." William's voice was calm but firm. "And we won't let them." As the officers processed the scene, a faint vibration came from Clara's phone. She glanced at the screen and froze, her face draining of color. "What is it?" Jackson asked. She handed him the phone, her hands trembling. On the screen was a single message, sent from an unknown number. "You've made a big mistake. We're watching." The message on Clara's phone sent a chill through the room. Jackson read it twice, his grip tightening on the device. William took the phone from him and scrutinized it, his jaw clenching as he handed it back. "They're escalating," William said grimly. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. They're making it personal." Clara sat down, her breathing shaky. "They know where I live. They're not going to stop." Jackson crouched beside her, his voice steady. "We're not going to let them get to you. You've already shown more courage than most people ever would." William nodded. "And now it's time to bring this fight to them. But we'll need more than just these documents. We need allies." Later that night, the three of them sat around Clara's small kitchen table, planning their next steps. The lockbox sat in the center, its contents spread out in neat piles. William sorted through the papers, muttering under his breath as he made notes in a small notebook. "We need to expose this publicly," William said, looking up. "The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be for them to cover their tracks." Clara frowned. "How?" "They have influence everywhere. City council, local media, even the police department. Most people won't want to touch this." William tapped the papers. "We don't need most people. We just need the right people." Jackson leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "I have a friend, another veteran, who's a journalist. She's always looking for stories that expose corruption. If we get this to her, she'll make sure it gets the attention it deserves." William's face brightened. "That's a start. Can she be trusted?" "With my life," Jackson said firmly. "Good," William replied. "Clara, can you make copies of everything in the lockbox? We'll keep the originals safe, but we'll need duplicates to share with Jackson's contact." Clara nodded, her determination returning. "I can do that. But what happens when this goes public? They're not going to take it lying down." William's expression turned serious. "They'll push back, harder than ever. But the more they fight, the more they'll expose themselves." The next day, Jackson met with his journalist friend, Natalie Rivera, at a small diner on the edge of town. Natalie was sharp-eyed and quick-witted, her notebook and recorder always within reach. She listened intently as Jackson laid out the situation, her expression growing more serious with each word. "This is huge, Jackson," Natalie said, flipping through the copies of the documents. "If half of this checks out, it's enough to spark a major investigation." "It's all real," Jackson said, "and we need your help to get it out there." Natalie leaned back, her pen tapping against her notebook. "You realize what you're asking, right? If I publish this, I'm putting a target on my back and yours." Jackson nodded. "I know, but people need to know the truth." Natalie studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll dig into this and start drafting the story, but I'll need corroboration, witnesses, additional evidence. Can you get me that?" "I'm working on it," Jackson said, "and I'll make sure you're protected." Natalie smirked. "You better. I don't plan on becoming a headline in my own paper." Meanwhile, back at Clara's apartment, William received an unexpected visitor. Officer Banks stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Judge Harrington," she said, nodding respectfully. "Can I come in?" William stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "What brings you here, officer?" Banks looked around before lowering her voice. "I need to talk to you off the record. There's something you need to know." William gestured to the table, where Clara was organizing the last of the documents. "Go ahead." Banks hesitated before speaking. "There's a leak in the department. Someone's been feeding information to Carter and his associates." William's face darkened. "Do you know who?" "I have my suspicions, but nothing concrete yet," Banks admitted. "What I do know is that they're watching every move you make. If you're planning something, you need to be careful." William nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me. But we can't stop now. Not after how far we've come." Banks sighed. "I figured you'd say that. Just watch your back. They're playing dirty." As Banks left, Clara looked at William, her face pale. "If there's a leak, they'll know about Natalie soon." William frowned. "Then we need to move faster." That night, as Natalie worked late in her small office, a shadow passed by her window. She didn't notice at first, too engrossed in the files spread across her desk, but when a faint creak came from the hallway, she froze. Her heart raced as she reached for her phone. Before she could dial, the door burst open, and two men stormed in. One grabbed her arm, while the other snatched the documents from her desk. "Stay out of this," one of them growled, shoving her back into her chair. "You don't want to end up like the others." Natalie glared at them, her voice defiant despite the fear in her eyes. "You think you can scare me? You've already lost." The men exchanged a glance before storming out, slamming the door behind them. Natalie quickly locked it and called Jackson, her voice shaking as she recounted what had happened. "We're coming to you," Jackson said, his voice firm. "Stay put." When Jackson, Clara, and William arrived at Natalie's office, they found her shaken but resolute. The documents were gone, but Natalie had anticipated this. She pulled out a hidden USB drive, holding it up with a triumphant smile. "They didn't get everything," she said. "I made digital copies." Jackson couldn't help but grin. "You're tougher than they are." William's expression was serious. "This proves we're getting close. But it also means they're desperate." As they spoke, Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and gasped, holding it out for the others to see. It was another message, this time accompanied by a photo of her apartment door, painted with a new warning in bold, red letters. "Next time, we won't miss." The photo on Clara's phone left the room in stunned silence. The words on her apartment door, "Next time, we won't miss," were a chilling reminder that the stakes had just escalated. Jackson clenched his fists, anger and resolve radiating from him. "They're not just trying to scare us anymore," he said, his voice low and firm. "They're trying to shut us down completely." William nodded grimly. "We're dealing with people who will go to any lengths to protect themselves. But we're not backing down." Clara's voice wavered. "They're watching me. They know where I live. What if they come after me again?" Jackson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We won't let that happen. From now on, you're not alone. We'll make sure you're safe." That night, Jackson and Clara stayed at a small motel on the outskirts of town, while William returned to his home to coordinate their next steps. Jackson didn't sleep much, his mind racing as he kept watch by the window. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders. but he was determined not to let fear take over. Meanwhile, William made calls to trusted contacts, reaching out to community leaders, journalists, and even old colleagues from his time as a judge. He knew that exposing the truth required more than evidence. It required people willing to stand up and fight. The next morning, William arrived at the motel with good news. "I've contacted a few allies," he said, sitting down at the small table where Jackson and Clara were eating breakfast. "They're willing to help, but we need to act quickly. The longer we wait, the more time Carter and his people have to cover their tracks." Jackson nodded. "What's the plan?" "We need a public forum," William said. "A way to get this story out where Carter and his associates can't suppress it. I've arranged a meeting with the editor of the local paper. If we can get them to run this story on the front page, it'll reach everyone in town and beyond." Clara looked uncertain. "What if the editor's in Carter's pocket?" William smiled faintly. "He's not. I made sure of that." Later that day, the trio met with the editor, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret Lee. Margaret had a reputation for being fiercely independent and unafraid of controversy. She listened intently as William presented the evidence, her sharp eyes scanning each document. "This is explosive," Margaret said, setting the papers down. "If I publish this, it'll blow the lid off everything Carter's been doing. But it's also dangerous. He has powerful friends, and they won't take this lying down." "We're prepared for that," Jackson said. "We just need someone willing to stand up to him." Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll run the story, but I'll need time to verify everything. And you should know. Once this goes live, there's no going back." "We understand," William said. "Thank you, Margaret. You're doing the right thing." As they left the newspaper office, Jackson felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed like they were making real progress. That night, the town buzzed with whispers about the upcoming expose. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by the leaked details from Margaret's office. Carter's name was on everyone's lips, and the tension in the air was palpable. At Carter's estate, the man himself sat in his study, surrounded by his closest advisors. His calm demeanor belied the storm brewing within him. "They're cornering us," one of his advisors said. "If that story gets published, it'll destroy everything." Carter steepled his fingers, his voice cold and measured. "Then we make sure it doesn't get published." "How?" another advisor asked. "The editor won't back down. She's too stubborn." Carter smirked. "There's more than one way to deal with a problem." He turned to a man standing silently by the door, a tall, intimidating figure with a scar running down his cheek. "Take care of it," Carter said simply. The man nodded and left without a word. The following morning, Margaret arrived at her office early to finalize the story. As she unlocked the door, she noticed a strange smell. Frowning, she stepped inside and froze. Her desk, her files, and her computer were gone, replaced by a pile of ash and smoldering debris. Someone had set fire to her office. Margaret staggered back, coughing as the acrid smell filled her lungs. Her heart sank as she realized the extent of the damage. Everything, her notes, her drafts, even the copies of the documents William had given her, was gone. When Jackson, Clara, and William arrived at the scene, they found Margaret standing outside, her face pale but defiant. "They think this will stop me," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "But they're wrong." William placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you have backups?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I didn't expect them to act so quickly." Clara stepped forward, holding up the lockbox. "We still have the originals." Margaret's eyes lit up with determination. "Then we're not done yet." As the group discussed their next steps, a sleek black car pulled up across the street. The tinted windows rolled down, and Jackson caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Carter, sitting in the back seat with a smug smile. He raised a hand in a mock salute before the car sped away. Jackson's blood boiled as he turned to William. This isn't just about exposing him anymore. He's making it personal. William nodded. Then it's time to take the fight directly to him. That night, the group gathered at a safe house provided by one of William's contacts. They began strategizing their next move, knowing that time was running out. As they worked, Jackson's phone buzzed with a new message. He opened it, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. "You're in over your head. Walk away, or you'll regret it." Attached was a photo of his family, taken just hours earlier. Jackson's grip tightened on his phone as he stared at the photo of his family, his heart pounding. The image was unmistakable. His mother and younger sister, smiling as they left a grocery store, completely unaware they were being watched. The message was clear. Carter and his associates were escalating their threats. William noticed the shift in Jackson's expression. "What is it?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Jackson handed him the phone without a word. William's face darkened as he read the message, his jaw clenching. "This is their way of trying to break you." Clara covered her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "They're watching your family? What do we do now?" Jackson's voice was steady, but there was a storm behind his eyes. "We keep going. If we back down now, they'll know they can do whatever they want." William nodded, his voice firm. "We'll protect your family. I'll call some people I trust to keep an eye on them." "Thank you," Jackson said, his resolve hardening. "But we need to hit Carter where it hurts, and fast." The group spent the night poring over the remaining documents in the lockbox, searching for a way to strike back. Among the files, Clara discovered a detailed blueprint of Carter's financial operations. It listed shell companies, hidden accounts, and real estate transactions that tied directly to his discriminatory practices. "This is it," Clara said, holding up the papers. "If we can expose this, it'll prove Carter's been running an illegal operation for years." William examined the documents, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about discrimination. These records suggest he's been laundering money and evading taxes." Jackson's eyes lit up. "If we take this to the feds, it'll be out of his control. He can't intimidate everyone at that level." William nodded. "Agreed. But we need to package this carefully. If anything's out of place, Carter's lawyers will tear it apart." The following morning, William made contact with an old friend in the FBI, Agent Rebecca Myers. Rebecca was known for her no-nonsense approach and her track record of taking down high-profile criminals. After a tense phone call, she agreed to meet the group at a secure location. Rebecca arrived at the safe house later that day, her sharp eyes scanning the room as William introduced her to the others. She was a petite woman with a commanding presence, dressed in a crisp navy suit that radiated authority. "I've reviewed the initial files William sent over," Rebecca said, addressing the group. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at a criminal operation that goes far beyond this town. But I'll need full cooperation and access to every piece of evidence you have." "You'll have it," Jackson said. "This is bigger than any of us, and we need to stop it." Rebecca nodded. "Good. But be prepared. Carter won't go down without a fight. He has resources, connections, and no moral compass." As Rebecca and her team began building their case, Carter's tactics grew even bolder. That evening, the safe house was rocked by a sudden explosion in the parking lot. The blast shattered windows and set off alarms, throwing the group into chaos. "Get down," Jackson shouted, pulling Clara to the floor as debris rained down around them. William shielded Rebecca as they crawled toward the back exit. The smell of smoke filled the air, and the distant wail of sirens signaled that help was on the way. Despite the chaos, Jackson's mind was razor-sharp. "This is Carter's way of sending a message," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "But he doesn't know we've already gone to the FBI." Rebecca nodded as they regrouped outside, her expression grim. "We need to move fast. If he's resorting to this, he knows we're close." The group relocated to a federal safe house under Rebecca's supervision. There, they finalized their plan to expose Carter. The FBI began discreetly interviewing witnesses, gathering bank records, and preparing warrants. Rebecca assured the group that they were days away from executing a full-scale raid on Carter's operations. Meanwhile, Carter sat in his opulent estate, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The explosion had been his way of demonstrating control, but it hadn't had the desired effect. The pressure was mounting, and cracks were beginning to show. "We have a problem," one of his advisors said, sliding a folder across the table. "The FBI is involved. They're building a case against you." Carter's calm facade faltered for a moment, before he regained his composure. Then we need to eliminate the problem. Permanently? What do you mean? Another advisor asked, clearly uneasy. Carter's eyes were cold. The documents, the witnesses, the meddling veteran, all of it. Take care of them, whatever it takes. That night, Jackson received another message. This time, it was a video. It showed his mother tied to a chair in a dark room, her eyes wide with fear. A voice off camera said, "You wanted a fight? Let's see how far you're willing to go." Jackson's blood ran cold as the video ended. He stared at the screen, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Clara and William rushed to his side, their faces filled with alarm. "What is it?" William asked. Jackson handed him the phone, his voice trembling with rage. "They've got my mother." William's face turned grim as he watched the video. "This changes everything." Rebecca entered the room, her expression serious. "What's going on?" Jackson showed her the video, his voice firm despite the fire in his eyes. "We're not waiting anymore. We're taking Carter down tonight." Rebecca hesitated. "Jackson, we can't rush this. We need to move strategically." "They have my mother," Jackson said, his voice rising. "I'm not sitting around while they hurt her. If you won't act, I will." Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice calm but firm. "You're not alone in this. We'll get her back. But we do this the right way, or we risk losing everything." Jackson looked at her, his jaw tight. "Then let's move." Rebecca nodded. "We'll deploy a tactical team." "But Jackson, once this starts, there's no turning back." Jackson's eyes burned with determination. "I wasn't planning on turning back." The tension in the air was almost suffocating as Rebecca coordinated with her tactical team. The FBI had traced the video to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, one of many properties tied to Carter's web of businesses. Jackson stood by, his fists clenched and his jaw tight, as agents reviewed the blueprints of the building. Rebecca approached him, her tone serious. "Jackson, I need you to stay here. Let my team handle this." Jackson shook his head, his voice firm. "That's my mother in there. I'm not sitting on the sidelines." Rebecca sighed, clearly torn. "I understand how you feel, but you're not trained for this." "I've been in combat," Jackson said, his voice steady. "I know how to handle myself. Let me come with you." Rebecca hesitated for a long moment before nodding. "Stay close to me and follow my lead. No heroics." Jackson nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Understood." The convoy of black SUVs moved silently through the dark streets, their lights off to avoid detection. When they reached the warehouse, the team moved swiftly, surrounding the building and taking their positions. Rebecca signaled for silence as she spoke into her radio. "Alpha Team, in position. Bravo Team, hold at the south entrance. Stand by for my command." Jackson crouched behind her, his heart pounding as he scanned the shadowy building. The warehouse was large and dilapidated, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Dim lights flickered inside, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Rebecca gave the signal, and the team moved in. The first breach was swift and precise. Agents stormed the main entrance, their weapons drawn and their movements coordinated. Jackson followed closely, his senses heightened as he scanned for any sign of his mother. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of rusted machinery and stacked crates. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of a generator echoed through the space. Jackson's heart raced as they moved deeper into the building, the team clearing each corner with practiced efficiency. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the darkness. "That's far enough." The team froze, their weapons trained on the source of the voice. From behind a stack of crates, a man emerged, holding a gun to Jackson's mother's head. She was bound to a chair, her face pale but her eyes defiant. "Let her go," Jackson said, stepping forward despite Rebecca's warning hand on his arm. The man sneered. "You think it's that simple? Drop your weapons or she dies." Rebecca raised her hand, signaling her team to hold. "We're not here to negotiate," she said calmly. "But if you hurt her, you won't walk out of here alive." The man laughed, his grip tightening on the gun. "Do you think I'm afraid of you? Carter pays me enough to take risks." Jackson's blood boiled at the mention of Carter's name. Carter's done, he said, his voice steady. You're just a pawn, and he'll throw you away the moment you're no longer useful. The man hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But before he could respond, a sharp sound echoed through the warehouse, the distinct click of a gun cocking behind him. Drop it, a deep voice commanded. The man froze as another figure stepped out of the shadows. One of the FBI agents who had circled around undetected. The agent's weapon was trained on the man's head, his stance unyielding. Seeing no way out, the man cursed under his breath and released Jackson's mother, tossing his gun to the ground. Agents moved in quickly, restraining him and securing the area. Jackson rushed to his mother's side, untying her bonds and pulling her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm fine, thanks to you." Rebecca approached, her expression both relieved and serious. "We've secured the building, but this isn't over. Carter won't stop until we take him down completely." Jackson stood, his eyes blazing with determination. "Then let's finish this." The raid on the warehouse had given the FBI a treasure trove of evidence, documents, recordings, and financial ledgers that tied Carter directly to the criminal network. But it wasn't enough for Jackson. He wanted Carter to face the consequences of his actions in front of the entire town. "I want him exposed," Jackson told Rebecca. "I want everyone to see him for what he is." Rebecca nodded. "We're working on it. We've already issued warrants for his arrest, but he's a flight risk. We need to move fast." Back at his estate, Carter was growing increasingly desperate. News of the raid had reached him, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the FBI came for him. He paced his study, his mind racing as he weighed his options. "We need to leave," one of his advisors urged. "Now, before it's too late." Carter shook his head. "No, running makes me look guilty. We need to discredit them, turn this around." "How?" another advisor asked. Carter's eyes narrowed. "We find their weaknesses. Everyone has something to hide." The next day, Jackson, Clara, William, and Rebecca stood in front of a packed courtroom as the charges against Carter were officially announced. The town had turned out in droves, eager to witness the downfall of the man who had controlled so much of their lives. Carter, dressed in a tailored suit, sat at the defendant's table, his expression calm but his eyes betraying his unease. As the evidence was presented, murmurs rippled through the crowd. The weight of the accusations was undeniable. But just as the prosecution rested its case, Carter's lawyer stood and made a chilling statement. "My client has evidence that will call the credibility of these witnesses into question." He handed a file to the judge, who reviewed it with a furrowed brow. The courtroom waited in tense silence as the judge finally spoke. "This is highly unusual," the judge said, "but the court will allow this evidence to be presented." As the lawyer approached the witness stand, Jackson felt a knot form in his stomach. Whatever Carter had planned, it wasn't over yet. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Carter's lawyer approached the witness stand, holding a thick file. Jackson watched closely, his jaw clenched, as the lawyer began to speak. This file contains sensitive information about several key players involved in this case, the lawyer said, his voice smooth and calculated. "Information that casts doubt on their credibility." The lawyer turned to Jackson. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to start with you." Jackson's heart raced, but he kept his composure. "Go ahead." The lawyer pulled out a sheet of paper. "According to this document, you were dishonorably discharged from the military for misconduct." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Jackson felt a wave of anger rise within him. "That's a lie," he said firmly. "I left the military with full honors." The lawyer smirked. "We have evidence to suggest otherwise." Rebecca stood up, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to deflect from the overwhelming evidence against Mr. Carter. I request that this line of questioning be stricken from the record." The judge, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, nodded. "Sustained. Focus on the case at hand, counselor." The lawyer scowled but continued, turning his attention to Clara. "Miss Stevens, it's come to our attention that you were fired from your job for tampering with official records. How can we trust anything you've provided?" Clara's face turned pale, but William stood, his voice calm but authoritative. Your Honor, this is another baseless attempt to undermine a key witness. Ms. Stevens' employment history is irrelevant to the charges against Mr. Carter. The judge agreed, silencing the defense's tactics. Carter's lawyer, now visibly frustrated, sat down with a resigned sigh. The prosecution resumed its case, presenting a damning array of evidence collected from the warehouse raid. The financial records, secret contracts, and testimonies painted a clear picture of Carter's crimes. The courtroom was captivated as the FBI played a recording of Carter instructing his associates to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. Carter's calm demeanor finally cracked. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. Jackson allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The walls were closing in on Carter, and he knew it. The trial concluded with closing arguments from both sides. The prosecution's case was airtight, while the defense's efforts to discredit witnesses had largely failed. The judge instructed the jury to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied as everyone waited for the verdict. Hours later, the jury returned, their expressions grave. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant, Charles Carter, guilty. On the charge of money laundering, guilty. On the charge of intimidation of witnesses, guilty. Each guilty verdict was a hammer blow, and by the end, Carter's face was ashen. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in cheers as the reality of Carter's downfall sank in. Outside the courthouse, Jackson, Clara, William, and Rebecca stood together, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. Reporters swarmed them, eager for comments, but Jackson raised his hand for silence. This wasn't just about one man, he said, his voice strong and clear. This was about standing up to a system that's been hurting people for far too long. We fought back, and we won. But the fight doesn't end here. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jackson felt a surge of hope. They had taken on a powerful enemy and won, but more importantly, they had shown the town, and themselves, that change was possible. Weeks later, Jackson visited his mother, who had moved to a safer location. She hugged him tightly, tears of pride in her eyes. "You're a hero, Jackson. I just did what needed to be done," he said with a smile. Back in town, the cafe where it all started had been shut down, and the community was already beginning to heal. People of all backgrounds began coming together, inspired by the courage of those who had stood up to Carter. As Jackson walked through the town square one evening, he saw Clara and William sitting on a bench, talking and laughing. He joined them, the three of them sharing a moment of quiet reflection. "We did it," Clara said softly. "We actually did it." William nodded. "And we'll keep doing it." This was just the beginning. Jackson looked up at the stars, a sense of peace washing over him. They had faced their darkest moments and emerged stronger. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there was hope. The fight was far from over, but for now, they could rest, knowing they had made a difference.